Hello, I'm Joan. I'm a Canadian family physician who also works as a restorative medical educator, facilitator, and coach. I create spaces that rehumanize the work of healthcare. I'm creating this podcast to remind myself, as well as anyone else working in a helping profession, that when you are working and caring for your human patients, you are the other human in the room. Hey, healthcare human. How often do you feel overcapacity, forgetting basic bodily needs, or feeling disconnected from your passion for healthcare? You're not alone, and there's nothing wrong with you. Our system encourages overworking, leading to burnout, mistakes, and drained empathy. But what if you could be the change you need? Imagine a workflow that honors your natural pace, a schedule with space for rest and pleasure, and a life where you get to express your full humanity. I've helped many clinicians create this space, and I'd love to help you in my coaching program, Creating Space. Creating Space is a restorative coaching experience designed specifically for overworked healthcare professionals like you. Join me and an intimate group of fellow healthcare humans on a transformative 7-month journey. Together, you'll learn the tools needed to reclaim your humanity, receive both group and individual support to navigate obstacles, and celebrate your efforts with a luxurious in-person spa retreat at the end. I only run this program once a year from October to April, and it is the only way to work with me privately. I am having so much fun with the current group of healthcare humans in Creating Space that I've decided to open early bird registration for the cohort starting this fall. From March 1st to 31st, you can claim your spot in the group and get the added benefit of access to a 12-month payment plan, as well as a bonus one-on-one coaching session with me anytime between now and when the program starts. These extra bonuses are only available if you register before April. So, if you're ready to take the first step towards a more spacious and satisfying life, go to joanchanmd.com/space and book your call with me. We'll have the chance to connect, get all your questions answered, and start planning how to create space in your life for you. Hello there, healthcare humans. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of The Other Human in the Room. I'm going to name right up front, if you hear a little extra rasp, a little husk to my voice, you think, oh my gosh, she could just like break out in a jazz standard any minute. Yes, I am recovering from a cold given to me by my beautiful small children, but I'm feeling well enough to be here today to talk to you on this podcast. And yes, the spring cold, a delightful form of the viral illness that we always have flying around us at these times. So I just wanted to name that up front. Anyways, on to what I'm actually wanted to talk about today. So I wanted to talk about this new concept. It's new to the world in terms of when the publication came out in 2023, and it is new to me as of like a month ago, when I did like a small group learning session with some fellow physicians. It's called a PBSG. We meet together once a month through this program where we can there's sort of pre-designed modules that take you through a topic and review the evidence, and you can discuss them and you earn a bunch of CME credits. It's awesome, by the way. And the one that we did was about cholesterol guidelines. And if this is not your first time listening to me, you may have heard me bring up my beef with cholesterol guidelines as a family physician, but also my celebration and joy and love for the fact that there are multiple pretty contradictory cholesterol guidelines out there really just proves the point that there is not one right way, one true way to do any kind of medicine, which for me is liberating. And it was in the midst of that PBSG where this term was mentioned that I immediately had to look into more. And the term was clinicians' time needed to treat. So essentially, one of the two guidelines that the module was going over is the PEER guidelines, PEER. Forgive me, I did not look up and have at my disposal what that acronym stands for, but those are the lipid guidelines that I like to follow, specifically because they
incorporate clinicians' time needed to treat into their recommendations. And so it was through reviewing that guideline that I learned that this was a term that not only just existed in a theoretical way and in my own brain, but actually out there in the world, actually already in the literature, part of the like academic clinical conversation. And it was very validating to know that there's like a fancy research science term for this thing, which you hear me talk about all the time. So the way I talk about it is honor your capacity. The way I talk about it is there's too much to do. You're never going to have enough time to do it. We only all get, 4,000 weeks on earth. We're going to die anyway. So what do you want to do with your life? Like I kind of say it in those sorts of ways. But there's a whole article here that talks about a whole body of work really of a number of clinicians that I'm now like obsessed with and will be inviting on this podcast if they wish to join me, that really have dedicated their like academic and research time to talking about this specifically in like kind of a quantifiable way. And I love that. Isn't it so great when like the science and the math like is resonant and in alignment with like how we know that we feel in our bodies and in our souls? So I thought I would actually just dedicate a whole podcast to this concept and do so by reading through excerpts of this article that introduced the concept of clinicians' time to treat. And so I'm going to be reading through this article. I'm not reading through every single word because some of the details I think are better sort of read and digested if you are interested, but I'm taking out the highlights and then I'm going to pause from time to time to sort of offer my commentary on it. Because I think that this is a concept that I would love to hear us talking about more. I think sometimes the way that we talk about this, we kind of just put in the like clinicians complaining to each other corner of the culture. So like, for myself as a family physician, something new will come up. So like actually just recently, I'm recording this in March of 2025, the beginning of this month in Ontario, the province where I practice, the province implemented new guidelines for cervical cancer screening. And so now instead of doing PAPs where, you collect cells from the cervix and look at them for cytology, we have now switched to HPV testing instead. And that it sounds like a simple switch, but let me tell you, just in terms of the time it takes to learn about the new guidelines and the guidelines themselves, in this case, it's not the guidelines so much as like the clinical pathway that the province has chosen to implement their view of the research and what would be best for people. And maybe when they weighed it all out, even if they'd thought of clinicians' time needed to treat, they would have done it anyway. But I would say certainly there was not that much acknowledgement for the fact that this new way of doing cervical cancer screening absolutely increases the clinicians' time needed to treat, because now there's multiple options of what happens next based on their health conditions. All of this is beautiful in the sense that it's tailored to different patients' needs. It might have been for the best when you weighed out all the things, but definitely I don't hear people talking about, we weighed out the clinician's time needed to treat and we weighed it against other factors. And here's how we mitigated the fact that we know that this is going to take more time for you to implement in your office. Nobody's having that conversation. No one's talking. The powers that be are not saying that, that I've heard anyway. Let's put it that way. Instead, it's sort of like the office talk where amongst us we say, oh my God, oh, now we're going to have to track more closely. Oh, geez, that's not going to be automated anymore. Oh no, we can't offload that to the nurses anymore because it requires more like clinical nuance. Shoot, that's going to be more time for us. Are they billing us more? Ha, of course not, etc. And so it's just said as like grumble, grumble. I already have too much to do. Maybe I should take an early retirement. And that's like literally where the conversation ends, because we think that that's it. We just are going to complain about it and then carry on anyway. And if we follow the guidelines to a T, then we've done what we're supposed to do, but now we suffer. Or if we take a shortcut, or if we get to do something right, or if we don't follow through every single step perfectly, now we're falling short, right? Like that's what comes up. And so the idea that this is something that doesn't need to be downloaded and suffered through and just complained about and felt the impact of by individual clinicians, but we could be just like as a culture within the discourse of us as professionals with one another, be making sure that when those who are giving us clinical recommendations, we can ask them, hey, in your calculations of these recommendations, where have you included clinicians' time needed to treat? And if they're like, what are you talking about? You can like reference an article from BMJ. Thank you very much. Official, the British Medical Journal. Is that what BMJ stands for? Oh my God. I assume, when you've only seen it BMJ, let's just go ahead and assume that's what it stands for. So I'm going to read this article to you and provide some commentary from my perspective as an Ontario family physician who's also deeply interested in the notion that when I feel most human, when I'm most deeply connected to my humanity, to my human body, to my sense of purpose, that I provide highest quality clinical care, and I can do it in a sustainable way where I don't immediately burn out and quit medicine. And I love that these folks who wrote this article seem to be, drinking from the same punch bowl. So this article was published in the BMJ on January 3rd, 2023. And the headline is, Guidelines Should Consider Clinicians' Time Needed to Treat. So I already love that. The authors of this are Mina Johansson. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. You are my new favorite person, Mina, and I will be sending you an email to invite you on the podcast. I looked her up, and she is a family physician in Sweden. And then the second author is Gordon Guyatt, who I am familiar with because I not only am faculty at McMaster University in Ontario, but I also trained there. And Gordon Guyatt is like kind of a legend and like evidence-based king around here, very anti-pharma influence on guidelines and stuff. And so love that he's continuing the good work in this other way, and I'm sure up to many things. And then the third author is Victor Montori, who, when I looked him up, appears to be an endocrinologist in the States, who some of the other talks I saw that he's given are all about clinicians being human. And so these people are my new heroes. So thank you so much to all three of you for co-authoring this fabulous article. Okay, so I'm just going to read through, like I said, and then I'll like say when I'm pausing and actually providing some commentary. So the abstract, just as a start. Clinical practice guidelines aim to contribute to efficient and high quality care. Efforts are already made to overcome barriers to implementation, such as lack of credibility because of financial or intellectual conflicts of interest, and clinicians' inability to change habits or keep up to date with new recommendations. However, what is rarely acknowledged is that implementing guidelines may require appreciable clinician time and therefore have considerable opportunity costs in the clinical encounter. Including an assessment of time needed to implement might alter the recommendations of clinical guideline committees and help clinicians to prioritize. So I'm already on board. I'm already buying the article. I actually almost did buy this article and it was going to be like £30. And then I realized that through McMaster, I could get it for free. So thank you so much to the university at which I'm faculty, because I almost was going to purchase this because I really wanted to read it. Okay. So first heading is called Squeezed Time. And like, if they'd wanted to make the actual like heading of this whole article Squeezed Time, I just think that's pretty great. What does it say? Several studies have shown the impossibility of meeting all guideline recommendations. For example, a simulation study applying all guidelines for preventative care, chronic disease care, and acute care to a panel of 2,500 adults representative of the U.S. population estimated that U.S. primary care physicians would require up to 27 hours a working day to implement and document all applicable guidelines. To fully satisfy only the recommendations from the U.S. Preventive Service Task Force would require 7.4 hours a day. So just pausing for commentary. You've heard me say this before, right? I've definitely said it on social media, and I'm sure I've said it in multiple podcasts. These studies exist, and 27 hours out of a working day is more hours than you have available to you, just in case you needed a refresher on the math. I would say we don't even have only 24 hours in a working day because sleep is necessary. So say you had zero life. You need it. What do you want? 6 hours sleep? We always say 8 hours sleep. Like, you're going to fail. You're not going to be able to follow all the guidelines. You're not going to be able to follow, even if you focus only on preventative healthcare. That's going to take you 7.4 hours a day to do. You're not going to have time for anything else. So this is where the liberation starts to come in. It's like, okay, it's actually impossible to follow all the guidelines. It's actually impossible to do everything that everyone wants you to do. So what do you want to do with your life, right? Like, the purpose of this article is not talking about that piece. The purpose of this article is saying, like, hey, people who give guidelines, I'm sure that you spend a lot of time writing guidelines because you care if they get implemented. So why don't you include this factor to really highlight, like, the key shining jewels that you know are going to have highest impact on patient well-being and lowest impact on physician workload, and balance those two factors out. And then your guidelines that you've, spent time poring over and writing out will actually be put into place, and you won't feel frustrated about it. Like, I think this is a supportive, lovely article for those who write guidelines. I'm not like anti the people who write guidelines. I also would love to have sort of the highest, best quality advice about what to focus on for any given condition for my patients as well. As a general practitioner, I absolutely rely on that. And so the purpose of this article is simply mentioning that. But I am saying to you, healthcare human, whether you even work in primary care or not, right? Maybe you're like, I never use guidelines. I use algorithms. I use the standard of care for my corner of healthcare. Trust me, clinician time to treat applies to you too, because there's too many things that you are being asked to do. And what if you, at least for yourself, included an estimate of how much time you think it will take for you to do said task, and that is a fair and valid reason to say yes or no to something. It's not you being lazy. It's important to guard the valuable resource that is you and use it to decide, where you are most effective, what has highest impact. Like, that, this is actually kind of part of the job for each of us individually. And thankfully, because of people like these wonderful people with this article, we invite those who are overseeing healthcare systems, overseeing clinical guidelines, to consider us as well. This article also does not specifically invite people in leadership. In my case, the Ministry of Health and governing bodies over not only how physicians are paid, but those that decide how healthcare resources are allocated. And I would invite all of those people as well to please look up and really consider a very simple calculation of determining the clinician's time needed to treat, and to use that when deciding how to, or if to, implement a change in healthcare. Thank you for my sidebar, and now I shall continue to read this article. Similarly, to implement the European hypertension guidelines in Norwegian adults, Norway would need more general practitioners than are currently in practice. And that's just for the hypertension guidelines, folks. That's not for the rest of the things you need to do. That again was my sidebar. Back to reading the article. And in the UK, implementing all lifestyle interventions recommended by the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, NICE for short, may require more physicians from all specialties and more nurses than currently available, according to our estimates. And this is unpublished data. Furthermore, healthcare policies also need to account for the time clinicians should spend listening in silence, noticing carefully, and co-creating sensible plans of care with patients. Any article is going to say co-create in it, I'm on board for that. If clinicians followed all pertinent guidelines, there would be no time left to care for other ill patients, and the healthcare system would collapse. I said that as if that was my commentary, but that was word for word from this article. And I don't know if you noticed the collapsing. And I'm not saying it's only because we're not considering this, but I'm going to go ahead and say a very important thing that we could all be considering more is this, because the amount of people in this healthcare system, and therefore the amount of time that we have to offer to our patients, does not match the amount that our patients would wish for us to spend. So it does make a good amount of sense for each of us individually, but especially collectively, to ask ourselves these like deeper, tough questions of like, what is the most valuable use of our time that we spend in clinical care? And can we please consider the time it would take to treat something before we implement a new guideline saying, is this the best thing ever, right? Back to the article. Clinicians clearly have to make choices about which recommendations to follow in which patients. This involves interpreting, prioritizing, and applying them to a diverse group of patients with needs and wishes that may or may not align with practice guidelines. But without guidance and under the pressure of time, decisions about which guidelines to implement at the point of care will be implicit, variable, and potentially misguided. To help guide such prioritization, policymakers may choose a few of the guideline recommendations and tie them to incentives, such as publicly reported quality metrics, no thank you, or pay-for-performance schemes, also no thank you. However, since clinician time is finite and scarce, the chosen interventions and patient groups will inevitably be prioritized at the expense of other interventions and other patient groups. Sidebar, this is absolutely something that happens with diabetes at least in Ontario. Diabetes visits specifically are billed with a special kind of code that means that you get more money. It's out of basket, which means you get the full code and it's prioritized. And listen, diabetes is a very important condition, but it doesn't go unnoticed by me or anyone else that because at whatever point in time, our particular schedule of benefits decided to prioritize this particular condition, it warps then what we as clinicians do. It shifts our behavior. That's what incentives always will do. It doesn't mean that we're weird or faulty. But it just goes to show how let's make sure that the thing that we're incentivizing really reflects the highest impact for all patients, right? Like it's just something worth considering, right? Back to the article. Thus, time spent implementing a particular guideline may carry a substantial opportunity cost, and the element of clinical care that is lost may be of more benefit than what is gained. A new strategy to address this problem would be for guideline panels to estimate the time needed to implement an intervention when determining the direction and strength of recommendations. A recent review of all lifestyle interventions recommended by NICE found that clinician time was not considered or estimated for any of the recommendations, and the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force does not routinely estimate clinician time needed to implement its recommendations. Clinician time is not explicitly included in GRADE, which is the grading of recommendations, assessments, development, and evaluation, widely endorsed and used evidence to decision frameworks for guideline development. Like if you've ever read a guideline, you'll see where it says grade, like the grading of evidence is like A through E, I think. And so when you look at that, you can see that it's often used, it weighs out like how many studies was it? Like what was the quality of those studies? How repeatable are these recommendations? And a lot of other criteria, I'm assuming. But it doesn't include the impact on clinicians' time. And so this is the point they're saying is to implement this way of viewing evidence as a way to weigh which kinds of evidence are worth recommending at like a high quality grade A level of evidence, right? Back to the article. Accounting for real-world implementation of guidelines would require guideline bodies to account for time constraints, estimate them, and consider clinician time in a structured way. To this end, we propose that guideline-setting bodies explicitly consider the time needed to treat. So the next heading says time needed to treat. This is where they have a very specific formula that they recommend that guideline bodies used. But I would imagine that other kinds of leadership bodies or other folks who are considering recommendations for clinicians could also use. I also wonder if it wouldn't be interesting, especially if each of us in clinical care, not do this every single time because that would have its own time needed to calculate, right? But especially if we're trying to make a big choice about a new policy we're being asked to implement, a new project we're being asked to bring on board, to at least ask ourselves or certainly to ask whoever's asking for our time to say, hey, can you first calculate for me what the time needed to treat's going to be here? So it's neat for each of us to have this information, send along this article, say, hey, here's the calculation. Could you do that calculation, please? And then I will use that to decide whether I implement this in my practice or not. Thank you so much. I plan to do this. This sounds very fun to me. So I will just explain. This is the part I'm not going to read in detail because it includes calculations, which I can't imagine will be super exciting to hear me like read out numbers. But I want to share like what factors are used to determine the time needed to treat calculation, because I think those are helpful things for us to be considering even in our own minds as we're deciding what's worth our time or not, right? So the time needed to treat, TNT, makes explicit the estimated clinician time needed to improve the outcome for one person in the targeted population. The clinician time needed to implement the recommendation for all eligible people in the practice, and the proportion of total clinician time available for patient care that would be needed to implement the recommendation for all eligible patients. So the three factors that are considered. The first, like they said, is the time needed to provide the recommendation to each eligible individual. So like for each person who comes into your office, what's the time that will take? And so things to consider is how complex and time intensive the task is. Is it like a 30-minute procedure? Is it a click of a button? Is it a handout? Like what is it? The frequency of which the task needs to be completed. So maybe it's really quick, but you're supposed to do it every single time. Like something that comes to mind that I think they even mentioned in here is like a lot of guidelines or recommendations are like screen all your patients for this, screen all your patients for this. And though that seems like it won't take a lot of time, and there are technological ways that could help where you have them do it ahead of time via email, etc. But like if I implemented every recommendation I've ever heard of things to screen all my patients for, I mean, think about also time that the patient is willing or going to spend doing that, but like they'd be filling out questionnaires for days, right? So that's a piece that's important to consider. Another factor that they even say in here are tools and technology available to facilitate the intervention. So like if it's a kind of screening thing that absolutely involves my body as the clinician and it can't be an emailed questionnaire, that needs to be weighed out as well, right? So that all goes under the first factor, which is the time needed to provide the intervention to one person. And then you calculate that also using the fraction of the population that this would apply to. So is this something that, 2 out of your 1,000 patients are going to need from time to time? Or is this something that like 50% of your practice will need every single time they come in? Obviously, that will increase the clinician's time needed to treat, right? And then the last factor that they consider is the clinician time available. So how many clinicians are available in the relevant practice setting? Who can implement the recommendation? Does it have to be a physician, nurse practitioner? Can it be a nurse? Can it be an unregistered, but someone you just hire to come do it in your office? Like who needs to be doing the intervention? And then they also estimate the proportion of clinician hours available for patient care in the practice, that was interesting to see what they estimated versus what I'm offering to my patients. And I'll get there in a minute. And so they go through a specific exercise, like they apply it to a specific guideline. And I just think the guideline they use is also quite interesting and makes it more real versus me just saying numbers. So I'm going to read that part out. To illustrate the use of TNT, we consider how it might apply to the NICE guideline, Physical Activity Brief Advice for Adults in Primary Care. And it's like a little warning. Whenever it says brief, you're like, is it going to be brief? That's my commentary, obviously. This guideline recommends general practitioners use questionnaires to screen all adults for physical inactivity and record the outcomes. For those not meeting the recommendations on physical activity, the clinician should give quote unquote brief advice tailored to the individual, discussing motivation and goals, current level of activity and ability, circumstances, preferences, and barriers to being physically active, and health status. I already know at this point that brief has a different definition for whoever wrote this guideline versus me. The brief advice should contain information about local opportunities to be physically active for people with a range of disabilities, preferences, and needs. The guideline encourages a written outline of the advice and goals recording the outcomes of the discussion, and following up in subsequent appointments. So I just want to pause again. So this is the kind of guideline. So say I was listening to a podcast that was people who love this guideline talking about implementing it, or I go to a conference and like the authors are there and they're like, everybody, it's just going to be a brief conversation and you're going to just change your patients' lives. And what I would be feeling in my body is so much resentment, guilt, shame, because I'm listening to them say brief, and the fact that I'm aware that a very large proportion, I don't know what yet, but like I imagine a good chunk of my patients are not currently following the recommended amount of physical activity. Again, not through any individual laziness or fault of their own. Typically it's because our entire society doesn't ask us to like work within our capacity. Everyone overworks and has too many demands and deprioritizes their own health. Like the same issue that's happening to me is happening to my patients. And now I'm supposed to not just be like, hey, exercise is good, but I'm supposed to do what sounds like a full-on coaching conversation with every single person, whether they like it or not. Probably it says something in there about consent, I would imagine. But like, and have like a catalog knowledge of all the different local options of how they could be physically active in my community or whatever community they work in, because or live in, because not all of my patients live in my community, and across different like disabilities and preferences. Like this is one of those guidelines that sounds so nice. It's ironically literally a nice guideline, but it sounds so good, and you feel like a bad person for grumbling about implementing it. Like, I know I should. I know this is important. I know that down the line, this might mean that less of my patients get things. And so what's wrong with me that I am not even just immediately jumping at the chance to implement this guideline? Do I not care about my patient's health? Like, that's like what goes through your head, right? But at the same time, a whole other part of your brain is like implicitly doing a TNT like calculation and being like, no, I can't even do the things that they want me to talk about. Now you want me to talk about this too? I know this is important, but everything's important. It's not like I wasn't already doing really important things, right? And then you feel all twisted up and you kind of hate the guideline people, though it's not only their fault. And it's sort of a whole societal and human story, isn't it? But I just like, when I read through that paragraph, I was like, oh boy. They should not have been allowed to use the word brief. I'm just saying. Even if they're like powerful, but like brief, that should have been flagged, in my opinion. And like, this is inaccurate. Like, this is false information to say that this is brief. And so anyways, thank you for listening to my commentary on that paragraph. Moving on. Studies cited by the guidelines suggest that offering this advice would take at least 10 minutes a patient. Again, what do you mean by brief? Do you know how much time most general practitioners take with their patients total? For the, remember, patients have their own concern that they wish to spend time talking about in an appointment. My appointments used to be 10 minutes long. They are now 15 to 30 minutes long, depending on the issue. So now you're saying I'm supposed to take 10 of those 10 to 15 to maybe 30 minutes in which the patient absolutely has something that they want to talk to me about that is not physical exercise. I can take 10 whole minutes out of those to do this intervention. You're cute, but it's not happening, right? Anyways, back to the study. All adults from age 19 are eligible. All adults from age 19, I guess, and up are eligible for screening. And roughly 40% of screened adults, because that's the proportion who wouldn't meet the UK recommendations on physical activity, would then be eligible for brief advice. So 40% of your 19 and up patients would be the people that you're spending at least 10 minutes doing this quote unquote brief intervention. Right. So without a calculation, I think each of us would, well, I won't speak for you, but I know, well, I would just describe my process. My implicit process would be like, I hear what you're asking me to do, and it's a no for me. But then I would feel all bad. And that's, that's up for me. I can feel my guilt and not do it. But it's interesting to think, what I like about this whole idea is to take these inhuman stories and actually just bring them to the surface and have them as a piece of the actual intellectual, academic, head first discussion, as well as doing our own like work where we just decide how much of this we listen to or not. I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So it's beautiful to think that we can meet, guideline recommendation people where they're at, people who implement different policy and projects within healthcare where they're at and say, hey, I hear you. You want me to do something new. And this is a calculation that will help me understand whether I'm going to say yes or not and actually have real numbers behind it. I love that. So then there's a few paragraphs where they say how they did the calculation. And the bottom line that they got to is that the absolute TNT in a practice of 2,000 adults is thus 10,000 minutes or 167 hours of GP time a year. That's a lot. And then they also talk about, so then they estimate like how much direct patient facing time a GP offers their patients per year. And so they estimate a GP who spends 60% of their 40 hours a week in face-to-face patient care and who works 47 weeks a year. And so out of that, then the calculation would be 15% of those hours would be spent doing only this guideline. So what this guideline is asking of GPs, and I'm using GPs because that's the language of the article. They're saying, hey, GPs, I know you got a lot on your plate, and they're not saying this directly because they didn't do this calculation, but if they had done this calculation, what they would have acknowledged that they were saying is, hey, GPs, I know you got a lot on your plate. I would like you to take, you can only go to 100%. That's how math works. Out of the 100% of time that you spend with patients, we want 15% of those to be spent counseling on physical activity. We think that it is more important that you do this than other things. Right now, 100% plus of your time is being spent doing patient care. And right now you're probably spending 0.5%. So actually, this would be really interesting. So it's like, we actually suggest that you removed the following things that are less important and then have them list what those are. Because that's the thing. It's like, so you want me to spend 15% of my total time with patients doing this. Okay, listen, if this was going to change the landscape of everything, I would consider it. It actually sounds like very interesting conversations to have. And I love coaching. I'm like, yeah, let's go. But so then what am I not doing? Am I stopping cancer screening? Am I turning away people with infections? Maybe which infections? Adults who are healthy and have had a sore throat for less than a day, I won't see them, but I will see kids with sore ears. And are you going to tell me to do that? Because right now I'm just deciding that. But if you're asking me to use my time in this way, maybe you should be a part of the conversation. So which things? Chronic pain? Are we taking that? Weight loss? Is that coming off the menu? What's coming off the menu? Tell me. So I just think that's really an interesting thing. If each person who's asking something of our times is co-creating with us the decision of what's going to be removed from our time in order to add this new thing in, that I would be so interested in those conversations. I want to be at those tables. I'm like, tell me, what do you think we should do? Because I'm also not sure, but I think it would be really interesting to actually have this conversation out. I had with my friend who actually is going to come on the podcast recently. We were kind of talking through what would come off our plates. One of mine would be forms. I've actually suggested this to a few people. I'm like, what if we just stop doing forms and we ask someone else to do them instead of us? Someone else, they create a new role and it's just all for the forms. So the forms are still done. It's not that the forms aren't still done, but what % of our hours do we get back to do things like this if we're not doing forms? And which would you prefer we do? Society, which do you value more? Tell me. I don't really love making this decision completely on my own. I would love actually for others to be involved in that conversation. Anyways, another thing I noticed. So, and I just because full disclosure, I like saying what I actually do, not because I'm the standard that you should measure yourself by in any way, but just because I like hearing real numbers myself and to know that there's a variety. So in this, they said that the GP is spending 60% of their 40 hours a week in face-to-face patient care. And I would like to declare that I spend 30% of a 40-hour week. I spend 12 hours with patients per week. And the nurse practitioner who works with me increases the amount that my patients are seen up to 18 hours per week on an average week. And that's just how that works for me. I also see patients in an asynchronous way. So I have more patient encounters than is captured in those 12 hours of booked a patient appointment time. And I do occasionally do like virtual psychotherapy appointments that I put in my paperwork afternoon. But I'm just saying on average, that's so my percent would be much higher because my overall percent of hours I spend seeing patients is lower. So the math is different for me. And I don't say that as a good or bad thing, but as a thing of FYI, that's how much time I spend seeing patients. And it feels like a good amount of time to me. So, there was more I was going to read, but this has already been 40 minutes. I realize because of all my asides, it's taking longer for me to read it than before. And some of this I'm going to summarize. So the next part is they just talk through sort of the specifics of how they imagine people who make guidelines could include TNT, time needed to treat, in guidelines. And it is interesting. And so if those of you who work with guidelines, they say you could use that grade evidence to decision framework and include it in there. I would really love if specifically, though, they included like the hours. And the folks that made this, at least some of the folks that like wrote this article, I found a website where they have done just a few different guideline reviews and done their own estimates of how much time it would take to implement different guidelines. And so, the nice exercise one they just mentioned would take 15% of GP facing time, or 167 hours per year. I thought I'd read out a couple other ones because I thought it was interesting. So like one was about a guideline around how to treating actinic keratosis. And that would take 60 hours per year if it was a 2,000 person practice. But they couldn't estimate the amount of benefit for one person because there isn't evidence of benefit to treating actinic keratosis in the way that's described in the study. So that's just another factor to definitely consider. You could be doing a lot of work and actually not have an estimate of benefit. And that's tricky. And so the other one I thought that was interesting was there was one about a UK guideline for corticosteroid injection for trigger finger, just to sort of give the flip side of how this kind of time to impact could be also like, it's not just useful to say what you're not going to decide to do, but it could actually sway you to decide to do something. My interest was piqued because this guideline, which I have not read at all yet, but apparently it says that if I implement it, it will take me 0.1, so a tenth of an hour in a practice of 2,000 people per year. And for every half an hour I spend, I will help one more person avoid surgery from a trigger finger. And I was kind of like, that's sort of neat. Also, I like procedures. So I was like, see how in this case, the amount of extra time it would take me is apparently very, very low, probably because there's not that many people in my practice who would have trigger finger. Like that's a bit of the calculation as we found, but the impact is high enough that it would have a real, and it states what the real outcome is that would be shifted if I decided to implement it. And so now I'm looking at that being like, because before I might have been like, oh, there's so many different options. I could do so many things with my time. Trigger finger, I don't know how to do that. It intimidates me, whatever. But apparently if I take the time to learn how to do that, it wouldn't be a ton of time to actually implement it. Though I do wonder if this estimate includes the time it would take me to learn how to do trigger finger injections. Something to consider. So do you see how it just like allows you to actually see in a quantifiable way that might feel better? We're math-minded folks. I know feelings are hard for a lot of you. They used to be hard for me too. And it's nice to have our feelings to guide us and our gut to guide us about what we decide to do with our time. But it's also nice to have a number once in a while because our gut could be influenced by different biases. It could be influenced by how tired or hungry you are on a given day. But numbers are numbers. And so you can say like, listen, I know you guys spent a lot of money on that very fancy guideline for that chronic disease that I'm aware impacts a lot of people. But when you actually look at the amount of time it would take to implement and how much better off the people would be, I'm not convinced yet. So like, come back to me later. And then you can kind of show through like numerically why that actually makes good sense, right? So the last bit I wanted to read was realizing the benefits. So this is the last part. So the ultimate goals of estimating TNT are to ensure that clinicians and patients spend their limited time together on what is most important for the individual patient and to improve access to care for patients with the greatest care needs. So this is like an equity issue, right? It absolutely is. Guideline panels also have limited time available, and we recognize the importance of not adding unnecessary burden to the already challenging process of guideline development. Although estimating TNT will add time, one of the strengths of the method is its simplicity, meaning that its consideration will not require advanced methodological skills. Do you see how the authors of this article are practicing what they preach? And they're saying, like, listen, we're asking you to do something, guideline people. And we've made a calculation that is not hard to implement. Like, doesn't take as much time to implement. Yes, there's still some effort required, but you see how they're like modeling the very thing that they're asking the guideline people to do for others. That's how I know these people are trustworthy, in my opinion. Like, these are the people I will follow because they're doing the thing that they're asking others to do. Integrity. And then the very last paragraph. In the meantime, guideline authors should routinely consider the time taken to deliver relatively low-yield interventions applied to large proportions of the population. Doing so will appropriately diminish enthusiasm for such interventions, moving strong to weak recommendations and recommendations in favor to those against. The net result will relieve clinicians of impossible sets of recommendations and increase the net benefit of their care. Relieve the clinicians of impossible sets of recommendations. It is just very validating to see written in plain text that the recommendations are impossible. So it is not you. It is not because you're not smart enough. It's not because you're not efficient enough or organized enough or whatever. It is because it's literally impossible. An article says so. So there's that liberation piece again. And the fact that it's impossible, and in the meantime, while these guidelines hopefully are listening to this advice, I don't know if they are or not. These things take time. In the meantime, to you, dear clinician, to you, dear healthcare human, it is okay for you to consider the time it will take you to do a thing when deciding whether you're going to do it or not. I know that seems maybe wild. You're like, obviously, but like, we say yes to so many more things than we have time for. And we do that because of deeply inhuman stories about like, we're selfish if we don't say yes. We will make people mad and that's evil and bad and a sin. Or like, there's all these ways we've been conditioned to override time estimation and energy estimation and capacity estimation. And it's to not only our own detriment, which would be reason enough because you matter, but it's literally to the detriment of the entire care system, the detriment to our patients individually and collectively, because we're just like bouncing around like pinballs in a pinball machine saying maybe this, and like half-heartedly applying things. That's fine, by the way. I love mediocrity. It's all good. But just imagine like we had a set of recommendations given to us that like deeply considered and honored our capacity, the time it would take, and then we would feel so much more inclined to know what to say yes to. In the meantime, you get to decide. You get to decide. I think we can all read, the summary of a guideline, like the one that I was read earlier, the exercise one, which like, no hate to the people who spent time writing that guideline. I'm sure they were like, this is amazing. This is so important. Exercise is so important. And because they're in the same system that we're in, they did not consider the implementation impact it would have on clinicians. And so, okay, in the meantime, we can decide for ourselves. Maybe we really do want to have that exercise conversation with someone, and that means that we don't harass them for the 5th time about their cholesterol and we don't care, right? Like, hopefully there's a trade-off you can make that gets something off your plate that you actually didn't want to have on your plate to begin with. And you can add in something that seems like it will be high impact, high benefit that you want to do. That's my suggestion of how you decide what to do with your time and capacity. And at the end of this, by the way, if you're like, okay, yes, but in the meantime, that calculation's not happening to guidelines, but you still want something that is kind of concrete that you can use to work through these decisions, that is literally what my Creating Space program is all about. I'm planning on releasing this on March 31st of 2025, which is the last day of the early bird registration. But even if you're listening to it later, I imagine registration will still be open for the fall of 2025 when the next cohort starts up. A free version of the workshop's available that you can just work through on your own. The methodology's all there. You can decide what to protect. You can decide what to quit. You can decide what to do with mediocrity, and you can decide what to delegate. There's a whole methodology of how to do this that I offer to you. In the meantime, while we're waiting for other societal factors to shift to recognize that our time is precious and worth guarding and guiding. But I do love that while we're doing our own work and not waiting for them and moving forward with ways to protect and honor our own capacity, it is a beautiful thing to know that there are other leaders in the field who are also caring about our capacity and are doing what they can to fight back on the inhuman stories that our capacity doesn't matter, that we should just keep piling on, even though we're over 100% as it is. Isn't that nice to know? I got excited enough that I recorded with a cold. It's an exciting concept to me. All right. Well, thank you so much as always for listening. Next time someone asks you to do something, consider asking them, well, before I decide to take on this project, could you first let me know, have you calculated the time needed to treat or the time needed to implement and execute this project? And if you could give me an estimate of the time it will take me, then I will let you know if it's a yes or a no. How cool would that be if we said that to each other? You're like, hey, can you do this for me? I estimate it will take you 15 hours of your time. And then they can just decide. So good. All right. I'm done nerding out. Thank you so much for listening. Talk to you next week.
I would love to take this work deeper with you. Visit joanchanmd.com today and discover my growing menu of options for restorative medical education to suit your learning needs. I offer one-on-one coaching, customized workshops, and self-study courses that allow you to connect not only with my work on a deeper level, but also with other healthcare humans just like you. So if you want to start humanizing your work in healthcare to a deeper level and do it in community with others, please visit joanchanmd.com and find those options and what fits you and your life today.